Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. We're sharing leadership conversations to help you develop unhurried rhythms of rest and work. We're helping you overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 269 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and as always, I'm so glad you've joined me here. It's my hope that this episode will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Now, they say that authors often write books that they themselves need. And this has certainly been true when it comes to what I've written about Jesus' rhythms of work and rest. I have a deep-seated efficiency and productivity engine inside of me. Now, while this has often served me well in my work, it has also gotten in the way when it comes to entering into God's gift of rest for me. It still feels like a discipline to stop producing and to simply embrace rest. When I do, I experience the grace and the kindness of God, but it's still often a challenge. I'll share more about that in a moment. Now, if you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so glad you found it. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'd love if you'd talk about this podcast with your friends and colleagues. Now, let me share a few key thoughts about counterfeits of true rest. Before I say more about counterfeit rest, it might help to say a few things about the theme of true rest. What is it? How do you know if you've rested? I like to think of true rest in terms of a series of RE words, words like refreshing, renewing, or restoring, or words like refilling, reviving, and reconnecting. Counterfeits of true rest do not produce these sorts of fruit. Instead of refreshing, false rest becomes rather stale. Instead of renewing, false rest leaves us stuck in old patterns. Instead of restoring, false rest leaves old brokenness unhealed. Instead of refilling, false rest has a way of actually draining us. Instead of reviving, false rest can leave us feeling dead inside. And finally, instead of reconnecting, false rest leaves us isolated and disconnected. This is what counterfeit rest produces in us. At best, counterfeit rest leaves us as tired as we were before, but at worst, the counterfeit nature of it leaves us even more tired. Now, in talking about counterfeit rest, let me share a quick word about counterfeits. Really, counterfeits are viable according to the value of what is being counterfeited. When have you ever heard about a counterfeit ring producing fake $1 bills? Never. But what about counterfeit $100 bills? They are valuable enough that producing a counterfeit of them is worth attempting. Now, the reason rest is counterfeited is that rest is of great worth. Rest is a beautiful gift that God gives us. It's a kind of Garden of Eden into which God regularly invites us. Rest is counterfeited because it is a deep and universal human hunger. Rest is valuable. So how do I learn to resist the enticing cry of these counterfeit calls to rest? I've said before that it requires effort to enter into God's gift of rest. But what does that effort look like? One of the main efforts required to enter into God's gift of rest is the willingness to offer a firm and basic no to the strategies of false rest that have become habit for us. We may need the help of a friend or a small group to let our no remain a no, so our yes to God's gift of rest can grow into a strong one. It's a chance to bring my sometimes unacknowledged thirst for true rest into the restful presence of God. You see, our souls actually want to rest. Many years ago, in my first 8-day retreat at the Campion Center in the western suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, I was introduced to a simple yet profound spiritual exercise. I was invited to ask the question, what do I really want? Really is a key word in that question. What are my true desires? Now, connected to this was an invitation to reflect on what was life-giving and what was life-draining in my current experience. So at the time, some of the desires that arose in response to that little exercise were mundane and unimpressive. I wanted pizza because I'd become bored with the cafeteria menu. I wanted to be back at home because I missed Jim and my home. But I also became aware of deeper desires that bubbled up as I lingered with this exercise. I wanted to help people see and follow the unhurried ways of Jesus. That idea eventually became my first book. In this spirit, I recommend a version of this exercise when it comes to your work and your rest. 4 questions you might ask yourself would be these. What is life-giving in my work? What is life-draining in my work? And then right alongside those, what is life-giving in my rest? And what is life-draining in my rest? It's this last question, what is life-draining in my rest, that could expose habits of counterfeit rest that, instead of refreshing and renewing us, are actually keeping us stuck in unhealthy habits of restlessness. There are ways we seek rest that actually drain us. Counterfeit rest makes sparkly promises that in the end it can't keep. Real rest tends to be more unassuming and more effective at the same time. Discerning what is true rest and what is counterfeit rest isn't a one-size-fits-all sort of proposition, because what is truly restful for one person might not be so restful for another. For example, working in my yard is often a very life-giving and refreshing activity, even if it is a little physically draining. But for someone else, it may only be a chore on a long list of other tasks needing attention around the house. That isn't restful. So let me take a minute to share some examples of counterfeit rest that I've noticed in my own experience and in the lives of others. First, anything that leads toward numbing will tend to be a counterfeit form of rest. I'm a big fan of numbing when it comes to dental surgery. I'd rather not endure a root canal surgery without Novocaine. But numbing as a life strategy is not a wise way to live well. We can numb out through overeating, through alcohol or other substances, through mindless scrolling on our smartphones, through binge watching shows that don't mean very much to us. Whenever we find ourselves killing time, we are probably numbing. Counterfeit rest will usually look like some form of escape or avoidance, or, as I said, numbing. True rest will usually look instead more like staying put, or feeling our feelings, or engaging our lives. True rest involves some sort of stopping. Counterfeit rest has a way of keeping us going and going and going. Now, as an author with a somewhat public ministry, I have to confess to a form of escaping or avoiding that might be a unique occupational hazard for me. I call it checking. What do I mean by that? Well, I find myself checking the current Amazon sales rank for my books. Are they doing well today? Well, then I feel good and satisfied with myself. But are the sales rankings falling? Well, then I don't feel so good. I feel restless. But this kind of checking is a way of distracting myself from what actually lies before me in my work or in my rest. Or this checking can be focused on how many downloads has my latest podcast episode received, or how many new subscribers do we have to our weekly email. Again, it's a way of avoiding the good work or the gift of rest that lies before me. It doesn't mean much in the end. Many of us probably do something very similar with our various social media feeds. How many people have liked the last post I made? Do I have more subscribers this week than last? Etc., etc. Another way many of us avoid or escape from our lives is through video games. Now, I have to admit that in the 1970s, I was a Pong kid. Our family got one of those early home video game consoles. We bought home Pong. Manipulating a line of light to hit a ball of light was slightly less impressive graphically than today's video games. Well, a little more than slightly. We also bought a pinball machine that lived in our family room. I can't tell you how many hours I spent trying to master that thing. And as a junior hire, I once spent an unimaginable number of quarters from my paper route earnings becoming the high scorer on a Pac-Man game at the racquetball courts our family had a membership to. So my habit of escaping into video games has had a long history. I'm not anti-gaming, by the way. It was a fun way to connect with my 3 sons as they grew up. But there are ways of gaming that are fun and challenging, and there are ways of gaming that are an escape from our lives and our tiredness. You'll know the difference by how you feel when you're done with a gaming session. Do you feel invigorated or do you feel drained? Do you feel challenged or do you feel a bit numb? As you think of your own experience these days, where are you finding rest? True rest. How are you experiencing refreshment, renewal, or refilling? Or in what ways do you find yourself avoiding or escaping or numbing? Now, I'm going to say more about how to do the good work of soul rest in a couple of weeks as the last episode in this 4-part series on rest. But meanwhile, I invite you to take a moment to talk with God soon about your own habits of rest. Ask the Spirit to help you discern how He might be inviting you into places of deeper and truer rest. Ask how the Spirit might be encouraging you to resist those little false promises of rest that are actually more draining than refreshing. I really do hope you'll take a little bit of time for a fruitful moment like this. I hope you found something in this episode that was helpful to you. In the next few episodes, I'll be talking with authors Scott McKnight and Barbara Peacock. I'll also be sharing one final episode in our rest series titled The Good Work of Soul Rest. If you'd like more help cultivating the unhurried way of life and work we talk about here on the podcast, I'd like to invite you to consider our training process called PACE. It's a certificate in leadership and soul care. It's the most robust training we offer. In it, we'll help you grow in your spiritual leadership perspectives and skills, whatever your role of leadership might be. This is a 21-month process involving in-person retreats and Zoom gatherings with mentored learning and practice between. There really has never been a better time to give focused attention to your own spiritual life so you can help others do the same. To learn more, go to unhurriedliving.com/pace. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living Podcast. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.